The autumn wind carried the acrid smell of smoke through the streets of Millfield Creek, mingling with the desperate voices of the auctioneer and the restless murmur of the gathered crowd. Sheriff Daniel Hayes adjusted his worn leather badge, his weathered hands gripping the reins of his bay stallion as he surveyed the scene unfolding before the courthouse steps. He hadn't intended to stop, had been riding through town on his way back from serving papers in the neighboring county. But something about the urgency in the auctioneer's voice had caught his attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Next item up for bid, called out Silas Brennan, a thin man whose sharp features seemed carved from the same unforgiving stone as the courthouse behind him, is one Evelyn Clark, age 24, in need of immediate placement due to unfortunate family circumstances. Daniel felt his jaw clench. He'd heard whispers about these kinds of proceedings in the larger settlements, where desperate families sometimes resorted to arrangements that shouldn't exist in civilized society. But he'd never witnessed one firsthand, never felt the collective shame of humanity press so close he could taste the bitterness on his tongue. A young woman emerged from the shadows of the courthouse, guided by a rough-handed man who seemed more interested in completing a transaction than showing basic human decency. She moved with careful, measured steps, one hand trailing along a rope that had been strung as a guide. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, and she wore a simple navy dress that had seen better years. But it was the white cloth band covering her eyes that stopped Daniel cold, and the way she held herself, straight-backed and dignified despite the degrading circumstances. When she reached the center of the makeshift platform, she stood perfectly still, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to sounds the rest of them couldn't hear. There was something almost ethereal about her stillness, something that reminded Daniel of the way deer paused in meadows at twilight, alert and graceful, despite the danger surrounding them. Miss Clark has been blind since childhood, Brennan continued, his voice carrying a false sympathy that made Daniel's skin crawl. Her family can no longer provide for her care, what with the drought affecting their farm and all. They're looking for someone willing to take responsibility for her upkeep, in exchange for whatever domestic work she might be capable of performing. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some men shuffled their feet and spat into the dust, while others leaned forward with the calculating interest of people evaluating livestock. Daniel noticed how they looked at her, not as a person with thoughts and feelings, but as a burden to be assessed for potential value. Now, I'll be honest with you. Folks, Brennan went on, warming to his pitch like a snake oil salesman at a county fair, she's got limitations. Can't see to do regular housework, can't tend fires without supervision, can't read regular writing, though I'm told she knows some of that finger-reading business. But she's quiet, obedient, and according to her family, she's got an unusual way of understanding people. Some might call it intuition, others might say it's something more peculiar. The young woman's head turned slightly at the mention of her supposed gift, and Daniel caught a glimpse of her profile. Despite everything, the humiliation, the casual cruelty of being discussed like a piece of property, she maintained an air of quiet dignity that struck him like a physical blow. She didn't cower or plead, she simply stood there as if she'd already accepted whatever fate awaited her. Bidding starts at $10, Brennan announced. Now, before you get excited, let me be clear about what you're getting. She can't see to do most household tasks without guidance, can't sew fine work, can't cook anything complicated, but she's docile, never caused a day of trouble for her family, and she does have this way about her. Some folks find it unsettling, others find it useful. Daniel felt sick. The casual cruelty of reducing a human being to a list of deficiencies, of discussing her limitations as if she weren't standing right there hearing every word, struck him as fundamentally wrong. He'd seen cattle treated with more dignity at livestock auctions. $10, called out a voice from the front of the crowd. Daniel craned his neck to see a heavy-set man with greasy hair and clothes that hadn't been washed in weeks. "But I want to inspect the merchandise first." Brennan nodded with the enthusiasm of a man eager to close a deal. "Fair enough, Josiah. Step right up." The man climbed onto the platform and began circling Evelyn like a vulture. He grabbed her arm, examining it as if checking for muscle tone, then reached for the cloth covering her eyes. She finally spoke, her voice soft, but carrying clearly across the silent crowd. "Please don't remove that. The light causes severe pain, even though I can't see it clearly." Josiah paused, his hand hovering near the blindfold. For a moment Daniel thought the man might show mercy. Instead, he laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. "Well, ain't that convenient? Blind woman who can't prove she's really blind?" "She's blind, all right," Brennan interjected quickly. "Family's got documentation from the doctor over in Riverside, born with damaged sight that got worse over the years. Nothing false about it." $15, called another voice. This one belonged to a thin man in a stained leather apron who reeked of the tannery district. "Could use someone to sort materials. Don't need eyes for that, just hands that follow directions." Daniel watched Evelyn's shoulders tense as the bidding continued. $20, $25, $30. Each increase felt like another nail being driven into her coffin. These men weren't looking for a companion or even a fair worker. They were buying someone they could control completely, someone who would have no choice but to accept whatever treatment they decided to mete out. "$35, shouted Josiah, his voice thick with anticipation. "And I'll take her off your hands right now." Evelyn's head turned slightly toward the voice, and Daniel saw her hands clench at her sides. For the first time since she'd appeared on the platform, she looked truly afraid. That's when Daniel noticed something that struck him as oddly beautiful. Despite everything she'd endured, being cast out by her family, put up for auction like property, discussed as if she were deaf as well as blind, her hands showed no signs of hard labor. In the world where everyone's hands told the story of their work, where calluses and scars marked a person's place in society, hers was smooth and unmarked. It reminded him painfully of his late wife Catherine's hands, which had been gentle and soft even after years of managing their household. Catherine had died 3 years ago from a fever that had swept through the county, leaving Daniel alone in a world that suddenly felt too large and empty. The grief had nearly destroyed him, turning him from a man who'd once believed in justice and community into someone who simply went through the motions of living. But watching this young woman stand there with such quiet dignity despite her circumstances, he felt something stir in his chest that he thought had died with Catherine. It wasn't romantic. She was too young, and his heart still belonged to his wife's memory. It was something else entirely. Recognition, perhaps. The understanding that comes from seeing someone else who'd been marked by forces beyond their control. $50, he heard himself say. The words came out louder than he'd intended, cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. Heads turned in his direction, and Daniel felt the weight of dozens of stares. He'd built a reputation in these parts over the past 5 years as sheriff, a fair man, but one you didn't cross, someone who kept to himself, but could be counted. And when trouble arose, Brennan squinted in his direction, clearly surprised. "Sheriff Hayes, is that you? Well, I'll be damned. Thought you'd sworn off. Well, thought you preferred keeping to yourself these days." Daniel urged his horse closer to the platform. The crowd parted before him, some out of respect for his badge, others out of unease. He'd always been a large man, made larger by years, of physical work and the authority that came with his position. When he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. $50, he repeated, his eyes fixed on Brennan rather than the woman on the platform. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. $50 was more than most of these men made in 2 months. It was an absurd amount to pay for anyone, let alone a blind woman who couldn't perform traditional labor. Evelyn's head turned toward his voice, and even through the cloth covering her eyes, Daniel felt as if she were looking directly at him. There was something in her posture, a subtle straightening, as if she'd heard something in his tone that gave her hope. $50, Brennan repeated, his voice cracking slightly with greed and surprise. Well, that's quite generous. Sheriff, anyone care to match that bid? Silence fell over the gathering like a heavy blanket. Josiah muttered something under his breath and spat in the dirt, but he didn't raise his hand. The tannery owner shook his head, and even the curious onlookers seemed stunned by the amount. Going once, Brennan called, barely able to contain his excitement at the unexpected windfall. Going twice. Wait, Evelyn said suddenly. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the still air. Sir, if I may. Why? The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure how to cross. Daniel found himself looking at her hands again, so smooth and unmarked, and then at his own scarred knuckles wrapped around the leather reins. His hands bore the evidence of his years as a lawman. Rope burns from wrestling criminals, scars from knife fights, the permanent stiffness in his left ring finger from where a bullet had grazed it during a bank robbery 2 years ago. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than he'd intended, weighted with emotions he wasn't prepared to examine. Because someone should choose kindness. She tilted her head slightly, processing his words. Then, for the first time since she'd appeared on that platform, she smiled. It was a small thing, barely more than a softening around her mouth, but it transformed her entire face. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, like ice beginning to crack after a long, bitter winter. Sold, Brennan announced, bringing his gavel down with finality. $50 to Sheriff Daniel Hayes. As the crowd began to disperse, grumbling about the unexpected turn of events and the sheriff's surprising participation in such proceedings, Daniel dismounted and approached the platform. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Evelyn was standing exactly where she'd been throughout the auction. But her posture had changed. She no longer looked like someone bracing for impact. Miss, he said quietly, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised several onlookers. My name is Daniel. I have a wagon here. Would you like me to help you down? She shook her head with quiet dignity. I can manage, thank you, but I appreciate the offer. She paused, seeming to gather her courage. What happens now? It was a fair question, and Daniel wasn't entirely sure how to answer. He'd acted on impulse, moved by something he couldn't quite name. The practical considerations, where she would live, what work she could do, how they would manage day to day, hadn't occurred to him until this moment. Now we go to my place, he said simply, and we figure out the rest as we go. She nodded, once then carefully made her way to the edge of the platform. As she prepared to step down, she stumbled slightly on the uneven boards. Without thinking, Daniel reached out to steady her, his hand catching her elbow. The moment their skin made contact, something extraordinary happened. It wasn't physical, nothing that could be seen or measured, but Daniel felt as if she was seeing straight through to his soul. In that brief touch, he sensed her reading the grief he carried, the loneliness that had become his constant companion, the way he'd been merely surviving rather than truly living since Catherine's death. And somehow, impossibly, he felt her understanding. Not pity or sympathy, but genuine comprehension of what it meant to carry loss like a weight that never lessened. "Your wife," she said softly, so quietly that only he could hear. She had a beautiful laugh, didn't she? The kind that made everything seem brighter. Daniel stared at her, stunned. He'd never mentioned Catherine to anyone in town, had kept his grief locked away like a secret too precious and painful to share. How could this stranger possibly know? How did you... he began, then stopped. Whatever had just happened defied explanation, and Daniel had learned not to question the few moments of grace that came his way. She seemed to understand his confusion. "I don't always know how it works," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes when I touch someone, I can sense things about them, their pain, their hopes, their memories. The church folk in my hometown called it a gift from God. Others called it witchcraft." "And what do you call it?" Daniel asked. She considered this for a moment, her head tilted in that listening pose he was beginning to recognize. "I call it the reason I've never truly felt alone, even when everyone else made it clear I was unwelcome." The matter-of-fact way she said it struck Daniel like a physical blow. Here was a woman who'd been cast out by her own family, sold like livestock, and reduced to her limitations, yet she somehow managed to see her unusual ability as a blessing rather than a burden. He offered her his arm, and this time when she took it, he was prepared for the strange sensation of being truly seen. It wasn't just her apparent ability to read his emotions, though that was remarkable enough. It was something deeper, a sense of connection he hadn't felt since Catherine's death. Together they walked toward his wagon, leaving behind the dispersing crowd and the shameful scene at the courthouse. Daniel helped her up onto the bench seat, noticing how she immediately oriented herself by touch, finding the handholds and settling into position with practiced efficiency. As he climbed up beside her and gathered the reins, she spoke again. "Sheriff Hayes!" "Daniel is fine," he interrupted gently. "Daniel, then, may I ask what happened to your wife?" He was quiet for so long she might have thought he hadn't heard her. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of old grief, carefully controlled, but never truly diminished. "Fever 3 years ago swept through the county like wildfire. Took her in less than a week." "I'm sorry," she said simply. "Loss like that, it changes everything, doesn't it? Makes the whole world feel different." "What's your name?" he asked, wanting to change the subject before the memories became too sharp. "Evelyn," she replied. "Evelyn Clark." "Well, Evelyn Clark," Daniel said as he guided the wagon away from the courthouse and toward the edge of town. "I suppose we should head home and see what we can make of this arrangement." As the wagon began to move, carrying them away from Millfield, Greek and toward the modest house that had been Daniel's refuge from the world, neither of them spoke about the strange moment of connection they'd shared. But both felt it, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, they'd found something in each other that they hadn't even known they were looking for. The road ahead stretched through rolling hills dotted with oak trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold and crimson. For the first time in 3 years, Sheriff Daniel Hayes wasn't traveling it alone, and Evelyn Clark, who had spent her entire life being defined by what she couldn't see, was finally going somewhere she might discover what she could truly perceive. The afternoon sun slanted through gathering clouds as they left the town behind, heading toward an uncertain future that somehow felt more hopeful than either of them had experienced in longer than they cared to remember. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts through the muddy trail as they climbed steadily into the foothills. Beyond Millfield Creek, Evelyn sat with perfect posture beside Daniel, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. Every few minutes she would tilt her head, cataloguing sounds and building a mental map of their surroundings in ways that fascinated him. "There's a mill wheel turning somewhere to our right," she observed as they rounded a bend. "The rhythm is steady, so it's well maintained, and I can smell fresh-cut lumber." Daniel glanced over, surprised by her accuracy. "Peterson's sawmill. Been operating there for 15 years. How did you know it was well maintained?" "Loose or damaged wheels create an irregular beat. This one sounds smooth, purposeful." She paused, inhaling deeply. "The smell of the lumber is clean too, not musty. That means they're cutting fresh timber, not trying to salvage old stock." It struck Daniel how much he'd stopped noticing about the familiar route to his home. Since Catherine's death, he'd moved through his days like a man walking in his sleep, focused only on the basic necessities of duty and survival. But Evelyn's observations forced him to really experience the countryside he'd traveled hundreds of times. The afternoon sun filtered through a canopy of maple and hickory trees as they approached the turnoff to his property. Daniel hesitated at the fork in the road, suddenly aware of what Evelyn would be encountering. His home wasn't the warm, welcoming place it had once been when Catherine was alive. The house itself was well maintained. He wasn't the kind of man to let things fall apart. But it had become more of a shelter than a home, functional, but stripped of the warmth that had once defined it. "We're almost there," he said, his voice tighter than he'd intended. Evelyn turned toward him, and even through the cloth covering her eyes, he felt the weight of her attention. "You sound worried." "It's not—" He paused, searching for the right words. "It's not much of a home anymore. I should have mentioned that earlier. Sheriff Daniel," she corrected herself gently. "I've been sleeping in a church basement for the past 6 months, sharing space with field mice and the occasional raccoon. Before that, it was a corner of my brother's barn when he could spare it. I'm not looking for luxury." Her matter-of-fact tone carried no self-pity, just simple honesty. Daniel felt some of the tension leave his shoulders, though he still dreaded the moment she would sense the full extent of the emptiness that had settled over his life. The house came into view as they crested the final hill, a solid 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and a stone chimney. It had been built to last, constructed of local fieldstone and timber that could withstand the harsh mountain winters. A well-tended garden stretched along the south side, and a barn stood intact beyond the main house, though Daniel kept far fewer animals than he once had. What the property lacked wasn't physical maintenance, but the intangible qualities that made a house a home. No laundry fluttered on the line, no flowers brightened the porch, no smoke rose from the kitchen chimney in the middle of the day. It was the home of a man who'd forgotten how to live rather than merely exist. Daniel brought the wagon to a stop beside the front steps and set the brake. The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken history. "It's peaceful here," Evelyn observed, her head tilted in that listening pose. "I can hear a creek running somewhere nearby, and the wind through old trees. It feels safe." Daniel climbed down from the wagon, grateful she'd noticed something positive. "Creek's about 50 yards behind the house, runs year-round, even in dry summers. The trees are mostly oak and maple. Some of them have been here longer than the county itself." He moved to help her down, but she was already stepping carefully from the wagon, her movements deliberate but confident. She stood for a moment with her head tilted, absorbing the sounds and smells of her new surroundings. "How long since you've had visitors?" she asked quietly. The question caught Daniel off guard. "What makes you ask that?" The silence has a particular quality. Places where people gather regularly sound different. There are echoes of conversation, remnants of laughter in the walls. This house is beautiful, but it's been quiet for a very long time. Her perception was unsettling in its accuracy. Daniel had indeed avoided visitors since Catherine's death, turning down dinner invitations and social gatherings until people stopped extending them. The house had become his retreat from a world that felt too bright and demanding without his wife's presence to anchor him. 3 years, he admitted. "Give or take." Evelyn nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Grief has its own geography, doesn't it? We build walls without realizing it, thinking we're protecting ourselves, but really just hiding." The casual way she'd identified his emotional state should have alarmed him. But instead, Daniel felt a strange relief. Someone had finally seen what he'd been carrying, had named it without judgment or unwanted advice about moving on. "Come on," he said, hefting her small traveling bag from the wagon. Let me show you inside. The interior of the house reflected the same careful maintenance and emotional emptiness as the exterior. The main floor consisted of a large kitchen with a stone fireplace, a sitting room lined with bookshelves, and a dining room that looked as if it hadn't been used for its intended purpose in years. Everything was clean and orderly, but there were no personal touches, no photographs on the mantel, no cushions on the chairs, no signs that anyone truly lived there rather than simply occupied the space. Evelyn stepped inside and immediately began her process of exploration, trailing her fingers along the walls and counting steps to build a mental map. Daniel watched her work, fascinated by the methodical way she oriented herself to new spaces. "The kitchen's this way," he said, guiding her toward the large room that had once been the heart of the house. Catherine always said it was too big for just two people, but she loved having space to work. "Catherine was your wife?" Evelyn asked, running her hand along the edge of the wooden table that dominated the center of the room. "Yes." The word came out rougher than he'd intended. Evelyn continued her exploration, her fingers tracing the outline of the cast-iron stove, the pump handle at the sink, the shelves lined with dishes that rarely saw use. When she reached the window above the sink, she paused. She stood here often, didn't she, looking out while she worked? Daniel stared at her, unsettled by the accuracy of her observation. Catherine had indeed spent countless hours at that window, watching the seasons change while she prepared meals or cleaned dishes. How could Evelyn possibly know that? "The floorboards are more worn right here," she explained, sensing his confusion. "And there's a slight depression where someone stood, regularly for long periods. Plus, the window catches the afternoon light beautifully. I can feel the warmth even now. It would have been a pleasant place to work." Her explanation was logical, but Daniel sensed there was more to her perception than simple deduction. Whatever gift allowed her to read, people seemed to extend to places as well, letting her sense the emotional history embedded in familiar spaces. "You keep the house exactly as she left it," Evelyn continued, not accusingly, but with gentle understanding. "Everything's clean and cared for, but nothing's been changed or moved. You're preserving something." "Is that wrong?" Daniel asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on the windowsill. "It's not wrong, but it might not be what she would have wanted. Most people who love us want us to keep living, not just keep remembering." The observation hit Daniel like a physical blow, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. Catherine had been a vibrant, forward-looking woman who'd never dwelt on the past or wallowed in difficulties. She'd always encouraged him to embrace change, to see challenges as opportunities for growth. The shrine he'd made of their home was probably the opposite of what she would have chosen for him. "I don't know how to change it," he admitted, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I don't know how to move forward without feeling like I'm betraying her memory." Evelyn turned from the window, and for a moment, Daniel had the unsettling sensation that she was looking directly at him despite the cloth covering her eyes. "May I touch your hand again? There's something I sensed earlier, but I didn't want to presume." Daniel extended his hand, curious despite his apprehension. The moment her fingers made contact with his palm, that strange sensation of being truly seen washed over him again. But this time, instead of reading his grief, she seemed to be searching for something else entirely. "She's not angry with you," Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with certainty. "Whatever guilt you're carrying about surviving when she didn't, about continuing to live when she couldn't, she wouldn't want that for you. The love you shared was meant to be a foundation for living, not a reason to stop." Daniel pulled his hand away, shaken by the accuracy of her insight. The guilt she'd identified was something he'd never acknowledged, even to himself. The terrible, irrational feeling that by continuing to exist after Catherine's death, he was somehow being disloyal to her memory. "How can you possibly know that?" he asked. "I don't know how I know," Evelyn replied honestly. "But sometimes when I touch someone who's grieving, I can sense what the person they lost would want for them. It's not always clear, and it doesn't happen every time, but with you, the message was very strong." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "Your wife had a generous heart, didn't she? The kind of person who made everyone around her feel valued and welcome." Daniel nodded, though she couldn't see the gesture. "She never met a stranger, always bringing people home for dinner, organizing help for families in need, making sure everyone felt included. Then she certainly wouldn't want you isolating yourself from the world. She'd want you to honor her memory by continuing to be the man she fell in love with, someone who protects and serves his community, who opens his home to people who need shelter." The truth of her words settled over Daniel, like a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For 3 years, he'd been trying to preserve Catherine's memory by freezing everything in place. But what Evelyn was suggesting made more sense. Honor Catherine's spirit by continuing to embody the values she'd cherished. "I suppose I should show you where you'll be staying," Daniel said, needing a moment to process the emotional upheaval of the last few minutes. "Actually," Evelyn said, "would you mind if I explored a bit more down here first? I'd like to get oriented before attempting the stairs." Daniel nodded, then remembered she couldn't see him. "Of course, take your time. I'll start a fire in the sitting room. It gets cold here once the sun goes down." As he worked with kindling and logs, Daniel found himself watching Evelyn move through his house with growing fascination. She approached each room like a scholar, studying a manuscript, her fingers reading stories in worn floorboards and faded wallpaper. At the bookshelf in the sitting room, she paused, running her hands over the spines of volumes Daniel hadn't touched in years. "You read extensively," she observed, carefully handling a leather-bound collection of Emerson's essays. "Philosophy, literature, history, these aren't just for show, they've been read repeatedly." "Used to read," Daniel corrected. "Haven't touched most of them since." "Since Catherine died," Evelyn finished gently. "Did you read together?" "Every evening after supper. She'd choose something, or I would, and we'd take turns reading aloud. Sometimes we'd discuss what we'd read, debate different interpretations." "That sounds wonderful, like having a conversation that lasted years." Daniel felt his throat tighten at the accuracy of her description. That's exactly what their shared reading had been. An ongoing dialogue about ideas and values and ways of understanding the world. Losing that intellectual companionship had been almost as devastating as losing Catherine's physical presence. "Would you read to me sometime?" Evelyn asked. "I know Braille, but I miss hearing stories told aloud. There's something about the human voice that brings words to life in ways that fingers can't quite capture." The request surprised Daniel. He hadn't considered that his evening ritual with Catherine might be something he could share with someone else without betraying her memory. But the way Evelyn framed it, not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as a different kind of connection, made it seem possible. "I'd like that," he said, and was surprised to discover he meant it. As evening approached, they worked together to prepare a simple meal. Daniel was amazed by Evelyn's competence in the kitchen, despite her blindness. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd learned to navigate the world through senses other than sight, and her cooking was far better than the basic fare he'd been subsisting on for years. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked as they sat down to a dinner of perfectly seasoned stew and fresh cornbread. "Necessity," she replied with a slight smile. "When you can't contribute to a household through traditional work, you find other ways to make yourself useful. I spent a lot of time in my mother's kitchen before things changed." "What happened with your family?" Daniel asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry. That's not my business." "It's all right," Evelyn said, though her expression grew more serious. My father died 2 years ago, and the farm started struggling. My brothers thought I was too much of a burden, another mouth to feed with no way to contribute to the income. They said keeping me was preventing them from finding wives, that no decent woman would want to join a family that included someone like me. The casual cruelty of her family's reasoning angered Daniel, but he kept his voice steady. They were wrong about that. Maybe. But it doesn't matter now. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to better things we never would have. It found otherwise. After dinner, they settled in the sitting room with the fire crackling warmly in the fireplace. Daniel found himself choosing a book almost automatically, a collection of short stories by Washington Irving that he and Catherine had enjoyed. But when he opened it to begin reading, he hesitated. This feels strange, he admitted, like I'm trying to recreate something that can't be recreated. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, settled in the chair across from him. What if you're not trying to recreate anything? What if you're just sharing something you love with someone who would appreciate it? The reframing was simple, but profound. Daniel began to read, his voice rusty from disuse, but growing stronger as he warmed to the familiar rhythm of storytelling. As Irving's tale of Rip Van Winkle unfolded, Daniel found himself watching Evelyn's face, noting how she smiled at humorous passages and leaned forward during moments of suspense. When he finished the story, she was quiet for several minutes, seemingly lost in thought. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'd forgotten how much I missed that, being carried away by a story told well." "We could make it a regular thing," Daniel suggested, surprising himself with the offer. "If you'd like." "I'd like that very much." As the fire died down to glowing embers and they prepared to retire for the evening, Daniel reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. This morning he'd been a solitary man going through the motions of existence. Tonight, his house felt less like a museum to the past and more like a place where new kinds of connection might be possible. Evelyn had been right about one thing. The worst things that happened sometimes led to better things you never would have found otherwise. As he showed her to the guest room upstairs and bid her good night, Daniel allowed himself to hope that perhaps he was about to discover what those better things might be. The first week at Daniel's homestead passed in a series of small revelations and careful adjustments. Evelyn had claimed the guest room overlooking the back garden, where she could track the passage of time by the changing angle of morning sunlight that filtered through her window. Daniel had fashioned a simple rope guide system along the most frequently traveled paths between the house and barn, giving her the independence to move freely around the property. By the third day, she had memorized every inch of the house's interior and begun venturing outside with increasing confidence. Daniel watched from a distance as she explored the yard, her hands trailing along fence posts and tree bark, building a tactile map of her new world. She moved with growing assurance, though she always returned before the sun reached its peak, as if reluctant to venture too far from familiar territory. It was on the 7th morning that Daniel discovered the true extent of Evelyn's extraordinary abilities. He had risen before dawn to check on his small herd of cattle in the pasture behind the barn, 6 head of breeding stock and a bull that comprised the remnants of what had once been a much larger operation. As he was mending a section of damaged fence, he heard an unfamiliar sound from the direction of the house, a voice, clear and melodious, rising and falling in a pattern he recognized but hadn't heard in years. Evelyn was singing. He paused with the hammer halfway to a fence post, the morning air carrying her voice across the pasture like something from another world. The song was a traditional ballad he vaguely remembered from his childhood, but it was the quality of her voice that stopped him in his tracks. It was pure and untrained, but naturally beautiful, with a clarity that seemed to make the very air around the house shimmer with possibility. When the song ended, Daniel found himself walking back toward the house, as if drawn by invisible threads. Evelyn was standing in the kitchen doorway, her face turned toward the sunrise she couldn't see, her expression peaceful in a way that made her look even younger than her 24 years. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Evelyn startled, her hand flying to her throat. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were close enough to hear. I'll be quieter in the mornings." "No." Daniel's interruption came out sharper than he'd meant it to. "Don't apologize. Catherine used to sing in the mornings. I'd forgotten how much I missed it." Evelyn's expression softened with understanding. She had a beautiful voice. "She thought she did," Daniel said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "I never had the heart to tell her she couldn't carry a tune in a bucket." The admission should have felt like a betrayal, but when Evelyn laughed, a genuine, delighted sound, Daniel felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 years. "I bet she made up for it with enthusiasm," Evelyn said. "Lord." "Yes, she'd sing while she worked, while she cooked, while she fed the chickens. Drove me half crazy sometimes, but the silence after—" He trailed off, surprised by how easily the words had come. "Would you like me to sing while I work?" Evelyn asked gently. "I promise I'll try to be less tone-deaf than Catherine." Daniel found himself smiling for the first time in recent memory. "I'd like that very much." And so a new rhythm established itself at the homestead. Evelyn would rise with the sun and begin her day with a song, her voice drifting across the property as she went about her morning tasks. She had taken charge of the vegetable garden, or what remained of it after 3 years of Daniel's half-hearted attention. Under her careful ministrations, the neglected plot began to show remarkable signs of recovery. Daniel discovered that her claim about having an intuitive understanding of growing things had been a significant understatement. She could indeed tell by touch whether soil was too dry or waterlogged, whether a plant was healthy or diseased, but it went far beyond simple tactile assessment. She seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to diagnose what each plant needed to thrive. "How do you know that tomato plant needs more water when it looks exactly the same as the others?" he asked one afternoon, watching her gently probe the soil around individual plants with her fingertips. "They feel different," Evelyn replied, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This one is stressed. I can sense it in the way the leaves respond to touch. They're slightly less firm than they should be, and the soil around the roots feels compacted. It's not getting enough water penetration." Daniel crouched beside her, examining the plants she'd indicated. To his eye, they looked identical, but when he pressed his fingers into the soil, he could feel the subtle difference she'd described, one area slightly drier and more tightly packed than the others. "Is it like what you do with people?" he asked. "The same kind of awareness?" Evelyn paused in her work, sitting back on her heels. "Similar but different. With plants, it's about what they need to grow and flourish. With people—" She hesitated, then reached out and touched his wrist where it rested on his knee. The familiar sensation of being truly seen washed over Daniel. But this time he was prepared for it and tried to understand what was happening. It wasn't telepathy. Exactly. Nor was it mind-reading in any conventional sense. It was more as if she could perceive the emotional landscape of his inner life, the geography of his hopes and fears, his joys and sorrows. With people, it's about understanding what's been broken and what's trying to heal, she finished softly. Daniel studied her profile, noting the way she held herself with such quiet dignity despite everything she'd endured. "How long have you been able to do this?" "Since I was very young, maybe 7 or 8 years old. One of the children in our church had lost his father in a logging accident, and he was inconsolable. During the funeral service, I took his hand to try to comfort him, and suddenly I could feel everything he was feeling. The grief, the fear, the terrible sense of being abandoned. but I could also sense something else. His father's love, still present somehow, still surrounding him. What did the people at your church say? Evelyn's expression darkened slightly. At first they were amazed. They thought it was a gift from God, a sign that I was especially blessed despite my blindness. But as I got older and the ability grew stronger, some people became uncomfortable. They started saying it was unnatural, that I was intruding where I didn't belong. Daniel felt anger rise in his chest, hot and immediate. They were fools. Perhaps, Evelyn said diplomatically, but fear makes people cruel, and what they couldn't understand they chose to condemn. I learned early to be very careful about who I let know what I could do. And yet you trusted me with it, Daniel observed. She turned toward him with that unsettling sensation of direct eye contact, despite the cloth covering her vision. You've been carrying grief for so long that it's become part of who you are. Someone like that understands the weight of secrets, the value of trust, carefully given. They remained like that for several heartbeats, connected by something deeper than mere conversation, until Evelyn gently pulled her hand away. The absence of that strange, warm connection left Daniel feeling oddly bereft, as if he'd lost access to a part of himself he'd forgotten existed. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Daniel made a decision that surprised him. Instead of choosing one of the familiar books from his shelf, he found himself talking about Catherine, really talking about her for the first time since her death. She would have liked you, he said, watching Evelyn's face in the firelight. Catherine always said she could tell a person's character by how they treated plants and animals. She would have been fascinated by your garden's sense. Tell me about her, Evelyn said, settling deeper into her chair. What made her laugh? What did she dream about? The invitation opened a floodgate Daniel hadn't realized was there. He found himself sharing memories he'd kept locked away for 3 years. Catherine's terrible cooking when they were first married, her habit of talking to the chickens as if they were old friends, the way she'd stay up all night reading when she discovered a book she couldn't put down. She wanted children, he said eventually, his voice growing quieter. We tried for years, but it never happened. She never complained, never made me feel like it was anyone's fault. But I know she grieved for the family we never had. And you? Evelyn asked gently. Did you grieve for them too? Every day, Daniel admitted, especially after she died. All those children who would never exist, all those moments of family life that were lost with her. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, her head tilted in that listening pose he'd come to recognize. Daniel, may I touch your hand? There's something I think you need to hear. He extended his hand, curious despite his apprehension. The moment her fingers made contact with his palm, that extraordinary sensation of connection flowed between them. But this time, instead of reading his emotions, she seemed to be offering something, a kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. The love you and Catherine shared, she said softly, her voice filled with certainty. It created something real and lasting, even without children. Every act of kindness you perform as sheriff, every person you help or protect, that's the family you built together. That's her legacy living on through you. Daniel stared at her, struck by the simple truth of her words. He'd been so focused on what he and Catherine had lost that he'd never considered what they'd actually created together. A partnership built on service and compassion that had indeed produced something meaningful, even if it wasn't the traditional family they'd envisioned. How do you do that? He asked. How do you see things so clearly? Maybe it's because I can't see the surface distractions, Evelyn replied. When you can't rely on sight, you learn to perceive other things, the deeper currents that really matter. The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Over the following days, Daniel found himself sharing more of his life with Evelyn, while she began to reveal details about her own journey that she'd kept hidden. She told him about the years of feeling like a burden to her family, about the small cruelties and casual dismissals that had shaped her understanding of her place in the world. The worst part wasn't the blindness itself, she said one evening, as they worked together in the garden. It was the way people assumed it meant I couldn't think or feel or contribute anything meaningful. They treated me like I was broken rather than just different. "You're not broken," Daniel said firmly. "If anything, you see more clearly than most people who have their sight." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you for seeing it that way. It means more than you know." Their domestic routine had evolved into something that felt remarkably natural. Evelyn proved capable of far more household tasks than anyone at the auction had imagined, moving through the kitchen and house with increasing confidence. She couldn't do fine needlework or read traditional writing, but she could cook, clean, tend the garden, and even help with some of the lighter farm chores. More importantly, her presence had begun to transform the atmosphere of the house itself. Daniel came home from his rounds to find rooms that felt lived in rather than preserved, meals that were shared rather than endured alone, and evenings filled with conversation and companionship rather than solitary silence. It was during the second week that they experienced their first real test as partners. Daniel had been called away on sheriff's business, a robbery in the next county that required his testimony at trial, and would be gone for 3 days. He worried about leaving Evelyn alone, but she insisted she could manage. When he returned, he found the property in better condition than he'd left it. The garden was thriving, the house was spotless, and she'd even managed to repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a windstorm during his absence. "How did you manage the fence repair?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Trial and error mostly," she admitted with a laugh. "And a lot of patience. I probably used twice as much wire as you would have, but it's secure." Daniel examined her work and found it not just adequate but skillfully done. She'd managed to weave the wire in a pattern that was actually stronger than his usual quick repairs. "This is excellent work," he said, meaning it. "Better than I would have done." The praise brought color to her cheeks. "Really? Really? You've got a natural feel for this kind of work." That evening, as they sat by the fire with Daniel reading from a collection of poetry that had been Catherine's favorite, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just 2 weeks. The house that had felt like a tomb was beginning to feel like a home again. The days that had passed in grey routine now held moments of genuine pleasure and connection. "Evelyn," he said, closing the book and looking across at her, "I want you to know that having you here, it's not charity or obligation. You've given me something I didn't even realize I was missing." "What's that?" she asked softly. "Purpose beyond just getting through each day. A reason to care about things again." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance to prove I could be useful, that I could contribute something meaningful to someone's life." "You've contributed far more than usefulness," Daniel said. "You've brought this place back to life." As they prepared for bed that night, both of them understood that they'd crossed some invisible threshold. What had begun as a practical arrangement, shelter for Evelyn, companionship for Daniel, had evolved into something deeper and more significant. They were becoming true partners, each contributing their unique strengths to create something neither could have achieved alone. The bond between them was growing stronger each day, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the kind of understanding that transcended the barriers most people erected between themselves and the world. Daniel was beginning to discover that healing could take many forms, and sometimes the most profound wounds were mended not through dramatic interventions, but through the quiet, steady presence of someone who truly saw and valued who you were. The autumn morning air carried an unusual urgency as Daniel saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness. Deputy Marshal Robert Kendall had arrived at midnight with news that the Whitmore family, homesteaders living in the remote Pine Ridge settlement, had sent word of a crisis that required immediate attention. Their youngest daughter had fallen through thin ice on the pond behind their cabin, and while they'd managed to pull her out, she'd been unconscious and barely breathing when the messenger had left to fetch help. Daniel had been preparing to ride out alone when Evelyn appeared. In the barn doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. "I'm coming with you," she said simply, her tone brooking no argument. "Evelyn, it's a 6-hour ride through rough country, and we don't know what we'll find when we get there. It could be dangerous." "A child is dying," she replied, stepping forward, with that quiet determination he'd come to recognize. "And from what you've told me about this family, they live too far from town to get proper medical help quickly." Daniel paused in tightening his horse's girth, understanding what she was suggesting. In their weeks together, he'd witnessed her remarkable ability to read people's emotional and physical states through touch, but they'd never discussed whether her gift might extend to more serious medical emergencies. "Evelyn, we don't know if what you can do would help with something like this, and if it doesn't work, then we'll be no worse off than we are now," she interrupted. "But if I don't try, if I stay here safe while a child dies when I might have helped—" She shook her head. "I couldn't live with that." Daniel studied her face in the dim light of the barn lantern. Over their weeks together, he'd learned to recognize the set of her jaw when she'd made up her mind about something. No force on earth could dissuade her once she'd decided on a course of action, and deep down, he admired her for it, even as it terrified him. "All right," he said finally, "but we take my wagon instead of riding. If the child needs to be transported, we'll need the space." As they hitched up the team in the pale morning light, Daniel found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. 3 months ago, he would have made this journey alone, focused solely on his duty as sheriff to respond to emergencies in his jurisdiction. Now he was traveling with a partner, someone who might be able to provide help that went far beyond conventional law enforcement. The road to Pine Ridge was little more than a rough trail winding through dense forest and across rocky creek beds. Evelyn sat beside him on the wagon bench, her face turned toward the sounds of the wilderness around them, occasionally asking quiet questions about their surroundings that helped her build a mental map of the challenging terrain. "Tell me about the Whitmore family," she said as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. "Good people. James Whitmore fought in the war, came west afterward looking for a fresh start. His wife Martha is from the back east, educated woman who chose frontier life because she believed in what they were building together. They have 4 children, and they've made a real success of their homestead despite the isolation." "And the daughter who fell through the ice?" "Lucy. She's 8 years old, bright as a penny, and curious about everything. Always asking questions, always exploring." Daniel's voice grew heavy with concern. "James mentioned in his last letter that she'd been fascinated by the way ice forms on the pond, studying it like a little scientist." Evelyn nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Curiosity can be dangerous when you're too young to understand the risks." They made good time despite the difficult road, reaching the Pine Ridge settlement by early afternoon. The Whitmore homestead was visible from a distance, a cluster of well-built log structures surrounded by cleared fields that spoke of years of hard work and careful planning. But as they drew closer, Daniel could see the signs of crisis. Neighbors gathered in the yard, horses tied hastily to fence posts, and an atmosphere of anxious urgency that was palpable even from a quarter-mile away. James Whitmore emerged from the cabin as their wagon pulled up, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. He was a tall, lean man with graying hair and the calloused hands of someone who'd spent his life working the land, but today he looked older than his 45 years. "Daniel, thank God you're here," James said, clasping the sheriff's hand with desperate gratitude. "Lucy's been unconscious for hours. We've done everything we know how to do, but she's not responding to anything." "This is my partner, Evelyn Clark," Daniel said, helping her down from the wagon. "She has experience with emergency medical situations." James looked at Evelyn with surprise, clearly not expecting a young woman, particularly one who was obviously blind, to be part of an emergency response team. But desperation had a way of making people willing to accept help from any source. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat respectfully, "any help you can provide would be deeply appreciated." The interior of the Whitmore cabin was warm and well-appointed, filled with the comfortable clutter of a large family's daily life. But all of that had been pushed aside to accommodate the crisis. 8-year-old Lucy lay motionless on the main bed, her small form nearly lost among the quilts and blankets her mother had piled around her. Her lips had a bluish tinge that spoke of prolonged cold exposure, and her breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible. Martha Whitmore sat beside the bed, holding her daughter's hand and speaking to her in low, encouraging tones. She was a woman in her late 30s, with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of quiet strength that frontier life demanded. When she looked up at Daniel and Evelyn, her expression was a mixture of hope and despair. "She was under the water for so long," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a few minutes, we thought we'd lost her. But then she coughed up some water and started breathing again. But she hasn't opened her eyes, hasn't responded to anything we've tried." Evelyn moved carefully to the bedside, her movements deliberate and respectful. "Mrs. Whitmore, may I examine Lucy? I work differently than a traditional doctor, but I might be able to assess her condition in ways that could help." Martha looked questioningly at Daniel, who nodded encouragingly. "Evelyn has a special gift for understanding medical situations. I've seen her work before." "Please," Martha said, moving aside to give Evelyn access to her daughter. "Anything you can do." Evelyn sat carefully on the edge of the bed and placed her hands gently on Lucy's forehead. The moment her skin made contact with the child, she gasped softly and nearly pulled away. "What is it?" Daniel asked, alarmed by her reaction. "She's so cold," Evelyn whispered, "not just on the surface. The cold has penetrated deep into her body, affecting her heart, her lungs, her brain. It's like her body's essential functions have slowed almost to a stop." "Can you help her?" James asked desperately. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved her hands to different parts of Lucy's body, her chest, her arms, her neck, as if reading some invisible text written in the child's flesh. Daniel watched her face, noting the intense concentration in her expression, the way she seemed to be listening to something only she could hear. "There's still warmth there," she said finally, her voice filled with cautious hope. "Deep inside, her life force is still strong. The cold hasn't extinguished it, just muted it. She's like a fire that's been banked for the night but hasn't gone out." "What can we do?" Martha asked. "I need to touch her directly, skin to skin," Evelyn said. "Sometimes I can share warmth in ways that go beyond normal body heat. But I need to warn you, if this works, it might look unusual." The Whitmore parents exchanged glances. Then James nodded firmly. "Whatever you need to do." Evelyn carefully placed her palms against Lucy's bare arms, closing her eyes behind the cloth that covered them. For several minutes, nothing seemed to happen. Then, gradually, a faint warmth began to emanate from Evelyn's hands. Not the normal heat of human touch, but something else entirely, something that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The warmth spread from Evelyn's palms into Lucy's arms, and from there throughout her small body. As it did, the child's breathing became less labored. The blue tinge began to fade from her lips, and her skin took on a healthier color. "My God!" Martha breathed, staring in amazement at her daughter's transformation. "How is this possible?" "I don't understand it myself," Evelyn admitted, keeping her hands in contact with Lucy's arms. "But sometimes, when I touch someone who's suffering, I can share something of my own life force with them. It doesn't always work, and I don't know why it works when it does, but with Lucy, I can feel her responding." The warmth continued to flow between them for nearly an hour, with Evelyn's face growing pale from the effort while Lucy's condition steadily improved. Finally, just as Daniel was beginning to worry about Evelyn's own well-being, Lucy's eyes fluttered open. "Mama?" the little girl said weakly, her voice small but clear. Martha burst into tears, gathering her daughter into a gentle embrace while James stood behind them with tears streaming down his weathered face. The other children, who had been waiting anxiously in the next room, rushed in to surround their sister's bed with exclamations of joy and relief. "How do you feel, sweetheart?" Martha asked, smoothing Lucy's damp hair away from her forehead. "Warm," Lucy said wonderingly. "Really warm, like sitting by the fire on Christmas morning, and hungry. I'm really hungry." The mundane request for food brought laughter and more tears from the assembled family. Daniel helped Evelyn to a chair in the corner of the room, noting that she was trembling with exhaustion. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "Just tired," she replied. "It's never been that intense before. The cold had gone so deep, and she's so young. Children's bodies work differently than adults, but she's going to be fine now." Dr. William Porter, the circuit physician who served the scattered settlements in the region, arrived just as Lucy was sitting up in bed asking for soup and biscuits. He was a gruff man in his 60s with wild grey hair and clothes that had seen better decades. But his medical knowledge was extensive and his dedication to his patients was absolute. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered after examining Lucy thoroughly. "When I got the message, I expected to find a child with severe hypothermia, possibly brain damage from oxygen deprivation. Instead, I find a perfectly healthy little girl who seems to have suffered no ill effects whatsoever from her ordeal." He turned to Daniel and Evelyn with curiosity. "James tells me you two were instrumental in her recovery. Care to explain how?" Daniel looked at Evelyn, unsure how to explain what they'd witnessed without sounding like they were making fantastic claims. But Dr. Porter was known to be a practical man who judged results rather than methods. "Miss Clark has experience with unconventional healing techniques," Daniel said carefully. "Some people might call them folk remedies, others might use different terms, but the results speak for themselves." Dr. Porter studied Evelyn with the calculating interest of a man of science encountering something that challenged his understanding. "Miss Clark, would you be willing to describe your methods? I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've never seen a recovery quite like this." "I don't fully understand how it works, Doctor," Evelyn replied honestly. "But sometimes, when I touch someone who's suffering, I can sense what their body needs and somehow provide it. With Lucy, she needed warmth that went deeper than blankets or hot water bottles could reach." "Fascinating," Dr. Porter murmured. "Have you ever considered working with a physician? Your abilities, combined with proper medical knowledge, could help a great many people." "That's actually something we've been discussing," Daniel interjected. "The possibility of providing medical assistance to remote settlements that don't have regular access to professional care." Dr. Porter's eyes lit up with interest. "Now that's an idea worth pursuing. I've been trying to establish better medical services for these frontier communities for years, but one man can only cover so much territory. If Miss Clark's abilities are as effective as what I've witnessed today." As evening approached and Lucy continued to show remarkable improvement, sitting up, eating heartily, and chattering excitedly about her adventure, the conversation turned to practical matters. Dr. Porter outlined the challenges facing medical care in the frontier territories: vast distances between settlements, limited transportation, lack of trained personnel and the particular difficulties of treating serious injuries and illnesses in remote locations. What you accomplished here today, he told Evelyn, goes far beyond what conventional medicine could have achieved under these circumstances. Lucy would have required immediate transport to a proper hospital, assuming she could have survived the journey. Instead, you provided exactly what she needed, exactly when she needed it. But it doesn't always work, Evelyn cautioned. I can't heal every condition, and I don't understand enough about medicine to know when my abilities might be helpful versus when conventional treatment is necessary. That's where a partnership would be invaluable, Dr. Porter replied. Medical knowledge combined with your unique abilities could create something unprecedented, a truly comprehensive approach to frontier healthcare. As they prepared to make the journey back to Daniel's homestead the following morning, the Whitmore family gathered to express their gratitude. James pressed a small leather pouch into Daniel's hands, payment for services rendered, but it was clear that their appreciation went far beyond monetary compensation. You've given us back our daughter, Martha said to Evelyn, tears in her eyes. There's no way to thank you adequately for that. Helping Lucy was its own reward, Evelyn replied. But if you really want to thank me, tell other families in remote settlements that help is available when they need it. Sometimes the most important thing is just knowing that someone cares enough to come when you're in trouble. During the long journey home, Daniel and Evelyn talked extensively about Dr. Porter's proposal and the possibilities it represented. The idea of establishing a circuit practice, bringing medical assistance to underserved communities throughout the territory, appealed to both of them for different reasons. For Daniel, it offered a way to expand his service beyond traditional law enforcement, to use his knowledge of the region and his reputation for reliability in service of something larger than himself. For Evelyn, it represented the chance to use her abilities in service of others, to find purpose and meaning in gifts that had too often been sources of suspicion and fear. Are you certain this is what you want? Daniel asked as they neared home. It would mean a lot of travel, difficult conditions, and we'd be dealing with life and death situations on a regular basis. I've never been more certain of anything, Evelyn replied. Today, when I felt Lucy responding to my touch, when I saw her parents' faces when she opened her eyes, that's when I understood what I was meant to do with my life. It won't be easy, Daniel warned. Some people will be skeptical of your methods, others might be frightened by abilities they don't understand. Then we'll prove ourselves through our work, she said simply. One family at a time, one emergency at a time. Eventually, results speak louder than prejudice. As they pulled into the yard of Daniel's homestead that evening, both of them understood that their lives had taken another decisive turn. What had begun as a practical arrangement for mutual benefit had evolved into something much more significant, a true partnership built on shared purpose and complementary abilities. They were no longer just a grieving sheriff and a cast-out woman, finding solace in each other's company. They had become healers, pioneers in a new form of frontier medicine that combined conventional knowledge with extraordinary gifts. The mission that was emerging would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but it would also give their lives a meaning and direction that neither could have achieved alone. The foundation for everything that would follow had been laid in a small cabin at Pine Ridge, in the moment when a dying child opened her eyes and asked for soup. From that simple beginning, a partnership would grow that would transform not just their own lives, but the lives of countless families scattered across the vast and often unforgiving frontier. 6 weeks after Lucy Whitmore's miraculous recovery, the first stranger appeared at Daniel's homestead with questions that carried an undertone of menace. Evelyn was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the unfamiliar sound. of a single horse approaching at a deliberately measured pace, not the urgent gallop of someone seeking emergency help, but the calculated approach of someone conducting business. She straightened, her enhanced senses immediately picking up details that would have been invisible to most observers. The horse's gait was that of a well-trained mount, expensive and carefully maintained. The rider's breathing was controlled, purposeful. Most telling of all was the absence of the emotional signatures she'd learned to associate with people in genuine distress. This visitor wasn't seeking help, he was gathering information. "Daniel," she called toward the barn where he was repairing harness leather. "We have a visitor." Daniel emerged from the barn, his expression immediately wary. In his 5 years as sheriff, unexpected visitors had usually brought either emergencies or trouble, and his instincts told him this wasn't an emergency. The rider who crested the hill was a man in his 40s, impeccably dressed in city clothes that marked him as someone far from home. He rode a magnificent black gelding that probably cost more than most farmers made in a year, and his bearing had the calculated confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of charm and intimidation. "Sheriff Hayes," the man called out as he approached, his voice carrying the cultured accent of the eastern cities. "I'm Preston Blackwood, representing certain business interests in Chicago and New York. I wonder if we might have a word." Daniel's hand moved instinctively to rest near his sidearm, a gesture so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed it. But Evelyn, attuned to the slightest changes in those around her, sensed the shift in his posture and the way his breathing had become more controlled. "What kind of business interests?" Daniel asked, his tone carefully neutral. Blackwood dismounted with practiced grace and approached them with the confident stride of a man who expected to be welcomed. He was handsome in a calculated way, with carefully groomed hair and clothes that probably cost more than most families spent on food in a month, the kind that recognizes exceptional opportunities when they arise, Blackwood replied, his gaze shifting to Evelyn with undisguised interest. "Word has reached certain influential circles about the remarkable recovery of young Lucy Whitmore. Quite extraordinary, from what I've been told." Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Through her enhanced perception, she could sense Blackwood's emotional landscape, and what she found there was deeply unsettling. Beneath his polished exterior lay a calculating coldness, a predatory intelligence that viewed people as resources, to be exploited rather than individuals deserving of respect. "Medical emergencies happen," Daniel said carefully. "Dr. Porter and my partner here worked together to help a child in distress. Nothing particularly remarkable about neighbors helping." "Neighbors? But that's where you're wrong, Sheriff," Blackwood said, his smile never wavering but his eyes growing harder. "What happened at Pine Ridge was indeed remarkable. Remarkable enough that certain wealthy families, people who suffer from ailments that conventional medicine cannot address, are willing to pay extraordinary sums for extraordinary cures." "Miss Clark isn't for hire," Daniel said flatly. "Oh, but everyone has their price, Sheriff. It's simply a matter of finding the right incentive structure." Blackwood's attention focused entirely on Evelyn now, studying her with the intensity of someone appraising valuable merchandise. "Miss Clark, I'm prepared to offer you accommodations in Chicago, a salary of $800 per month, and the opportunity to help some of the most influential people in America." $800 per month was a fortune beyond imagination. More money than most people saw in a lifetime. But Evelyn could sense the strings attached to such an offer, the web of control and obligation that would come with accepting Blackwood's patronage. "I'm not interested in your offer, Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly but firmly. "My abilities aren't for sale." Blackwood's expression remained pleasant, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "You're currently living in rather rustic conditions. Miss Clark, limited opportunities to use your gift for the greater good. In Chicago, you could help hundreds of people, perhaps thousands. People who can afford to pay, Daniel interjected grimly. Well, naturally. Charity is admirable, Sheriff, but it's hardly sustainable. Miss Clark's abilities are too valuable to waste on frontier farmers and backwoods families. The casual dismissal of the people Daniel had sworn to protect struck him like a physical blow. Those frontier farmers and backwoods families are American citizens who deserve medical care just as much as your wealthy clients. Deserve, perhaps, but can they pay for it? Miss Clark's talents could generate enormous wealth that could fund medical research, build hospitals, advance the cause of healing on a scale you can't imagine from this isolated homestead. Evelyn stepped forward, her posture radiating. Quiet dignity despite the pressure of Blackwood's attention. Mr. Blackwood, even if I were interested in your proposal, which I'm not, how would you ensure that my abilities would be used ethically? What guarantee would I have that I wouldn't become a prisoner of my own gift? Blackwood's smile became predatory. My dear, you're thinking too small. With the right backing, the right connections, you could become the most sought-after healer. In America, kings would pay fortunes for your services. And if I refuse? The temperature in Blackwood's voice dropped several degrees, though his smile never wavered. Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, Miss Clark, gifts like yours don't go unnoticed for long. If you won't come willingly, there are other ways to ensure that your talents are properly utilized. Daniel stepped closer to Evelyn, his body, language protective, and his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to dealing with threats. Are you threatening us, Mr. Blackwood? Threatening? Oh, no, Sheriff. I'm simply stating facts. Miss Clark's existence has become a matter of considerable interest to people with significant resources and influence. There are questions about how she was acquired, whether proper legal procedures were followed, whether she's being held against her will. The implication was clear, and it struck Evelyn like a physical blow. Blackwood was threatening to expose the circumstances of her purchase at the auction, to paint Daniel as someone who had bought her for unsavory purposes. Those are lies, Daniel said, his voice dangerously low. Are they? Perception can be very powerful, Sheriff. The story of a widowed lawman purchasing a young blind woman at public auction, well, that could be interpreted in various ways, couldn't it? Particularly if certain details were emphasized over others. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face as she understood the full scope of Blackwood's threat. He wasn't just offering money, he was threatening to destroy Daniel's reputation and career if she refused to cooperate. I need time to consider. Your offer? She said carefully, her mind racing as she tried to find a way out of the trap Blackwood had laid. Of course, my dear. Take all the time you need. I'll be staying at the Millfield Creek Hotel for the next week. After that, he shrugged elegantly. Well, after that, the situation may become more complicated. As quickly as he had arrived, Blackwood departed, leaving Daniel and Evelyn standing in the yard, with the morning suddenly feeling much less peaceful. He means it, Evelyn said quietly, her voice tight with worry. About making trouble for you. Men like that have connections, influence. They can destroy reputations with a few well-placed words. Let him try, Daniel replied, but she could hear the uncertainty beneath his bravado. Daniel, think about what he's suggesting. A sheriff who bought a young woman at auction, in the wrong light, it looks exactly like what he's implying. You could lose your badge, your position, everything you've worked for. They spent the rest of the day in tense discussion, weighing their limited options. Blackwood's threat was particularly insidious because it contained just enough truth to be believable. Daniel had indeed purchased Evelyn at an auction, and without context, that transaction could easily be misrepresented. Their crisis deepened 2 days later when Deputy Marshal Robert Kendall arrived with disturbing news. He was a good man, someone Daniel had worked with for years, but his expression was troubled as he dismounted in their yard. "Daniel, I need to talk to you about some inquiries I've been getting," Kendall said without preamble. "Official inquiries about your domestic arrangements." "What kind of inquiries?" Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Questions about Miss Clark. How she came to be living here, what her legal status is, whether she's here voluntarily or under some form of coercion." Kendall's expression was sympathetic but concerned. "There are some powerful people asking these questions, Daniel. People with connections to territorial and federal authorities." Evelyn felt her heart sink. Blackwood was moving faster than they'd anticipated, using his influence to put official pressure on their situation. "What have you told them?" Daniel asked. "The truth, that you've provided shelter for someone who needed it, that she's contributing to the community through medical assistance, that everything I've observed suggests she's here by choice." Kendall paused, his expression growing more serious. "But Daniel, they're not just asking about Miss Clark, they're asking about you too, about your judgment, your fitness for duty, whether you've been compromised in some way." The attack on Daniel's professional reputation was exactly what Blackwood had threatened, and it was proving to be devastatingly effective. In a profession where trust and respect were essential, even unfounded questions about an officer's character could be career-ending. That evening brought an even more disturbing development. Dr. Porter arrived unexpectedly, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. "Daniel, Evelyn, we need to talk," he said as soon as he was inside the house. "I've been hearing things in my travels, rumors, questions, official inquiries about our work together." "What kind of questions?" Evelyn asked, though she was beginning to understand the scope of Blackwood's campaign against them. "Questions about medical fraud, about unauthorized practice of medicine, about whether I'm providing cover for someone practicing witchcraft or other dangerous superstitions." Dr. Porter's face was grim. "Someone's been spreading the story that Miss Clark is deceiving vulnerable families with false cures, possibly endangering lives by discouraging proper medical treatment." "That's absurd," Daniel protested. "Lucy Whitmore is alive because of Evelyn's intervention. The family will testify to that." And they would, gladly. But the people spreading these rumors aren't interested in testimonials from frontier families. They're painting us as charlatans who prey on desperate people in remote areas where proper oversight is impossible. The systematic nature of the attack was becoming clear. Blackwood wasn't just threatening them personally, he was undermining their mission, their relationships with the communities they served, and their partnerships with legitimate medical professionals. "There's more," Dr. Porter continued reluctantly. "I've been contacted by territorial medical authorities. They're threatening to investigate my credentials, possibly revoke my license to practice if I continue to associate with unauthorized healers." The implications were staggering. Without Dr. Porter's partnership, Evelyn's work would lose its medical legitimacy. She would be reduced to folk healing at best, witchcraft accusations at worst. "What do you recommend?" Daniel asked. "Honestly, I think you should consider Mr. Blackwood's offer seriously. The people he represents have the power to make these problems disappear. They also have the power to make them much, much worse." That night, as they sat by the fire discussing their increasingly desperate situation, Evelyn made a decision that both terrified and liberated her. "I'm going to meet with Blackwood," she announced, "not to accept his offer, but to understand exactly what we're facing." "Absolutely not," Daniel said immediately. "It's too dangerous. Men like that don't negotiate in good faith. And we can't fight an enemy we don't understand," Evelyn replied. "I need to know what he really wants, what his ultimate goal is. Maybe I can find some weakness, some way to turn his own methods against him." "Evelyn, Daniel, listen to me. He's systematically destroying everything we've built. Your career, Dr. Porter's practice, our mission to help frontier families. We can't just hide here and hope he goes away. We need to understand what we're really fighting. The next morning, against Daniel's strong objections, Evelyn made her way to the Millfield Creek Hotel. Daniel insisted on accompanying her, positioning himself in the hotel's main room where he could intervene if necessary while staying out of direct sight. Blackwood received her in his private suite, a lavishly appointed room that seemed designed to emphasize the luxury and comfort he could provide. He was gracious, charming, and utterly ruthless in his pitch. "Miss Clark, how delightful that you've decided to hear my proposal in detail," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat in an expensive upholstered chair. "I trust you've had time to consider the complications that might arise if we can't reach an understanding." "I want to know what you really want," Evelyn said directly. "This isn't just about hiring a healer for wealthy clients. What's your real objective?" Blackwood's smile grew more genuine, as if he appreciated her directness. "Very perceptive. You're quite right. This goes far beyond simple medical services. My employers represent a consortium of industrial and political interests who understand that power in the modern world comes from controlling rare and valuable resources. You're talking about controlling me. I'm talking about harnessing your abilities for purposes that serve the greater good. Imagine, Miss Clark, if your gift could be studied, understood, perhaps even replicated, the medical advances, the scientific breakthroughs, the benefits to humanity, under your control. Under proper guidance, yes. The frontier is no place for abilities like yours. You belong in research facilities, working with the finest medical minds, contributing to advances that could revolutionize healing itself." Evelyn realized with growing horror that Blackwood wasn't just offering employment. He was describing a form of captivity disguised as opportunity. She would become a test subject as much as a healer, her abilities studied and exploited by people who saw her as a resource rather than a person. "And if I refuse, then you'll discover how difficult life can become for people who possess valuable things but lack the power to protect them. Sheriff Hayes will lose his position. I can guarantee that. Dr. Porter will lose his medical license. The families you've helped will begin to question whether your interventions were genuine healing or dangerous deception. You'd hurt innocent people to get to me. I'd remove obstacles that prevent you from accepting your true destiny," Blackwood corrected smoothly. "The choice is yours, Miss Clark. Come with me willingly, and your friends remain safe. Continue to resist, and watch everything you care about be systematically destroyed." As Evelyn left the hotel and rejoined Daniel, she carried with her the full understanding of what they were facing. Blackwood and his employers weren't just wealthy people seeking medical services. They were powerful interests who saw her abilities as a commodity to be controlled and exploited. The fight ahead would be about more than her personal freedom. It would determine whether her gift would be used to serve those who needed it most or those who could pay the highest price. The battle lines were drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. The crisis that would define everything came on a bitter November morning when Federal Marshal Theodore Garrison arrived at Daniel's homestead with an official warrant and a team of 4 armed deputies. Evelyn was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when she heard the distinctive sound of multiple horses approaching in formation, the measured cadence of law enforcement conducting official business. "Daniel," she called, her voice tight with apprehension. Through the kitchen window, she could sense the emotional signatures of the approaching riders, determination, authority, and underneath it all, reluctance. These weren't men eager for confrontation, but they were committed to following orders. Daniel emerged from the barn where he'd been feeding the horses, his face grim as he recognized the federal jurisdiction markers on the lead rider's uniform. Marshal Garrison was a man Daniel knew by reputation, honest, methodical, and utterly committed to upholding federal law regardless of personal feelings. "Sheriff Hayes," Garrison called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "I'm Federal Marshal Theodore Garrison. I have a warrant for the arrest of one Evelyn Clark on charges of practicing medicine without proper credentials and conspiracy to defraud the citizens of this territory." The words hit Daniel like physical blows. Blackwood had made good on his threats, using his influence to transform Evelyn's gift into federal crimes. The systematic campaign of character assassination had culminated in legal action that could destroy not only Evelyn's freedom, but everything they'd worked to build together. "May I see the warrant?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled. Despite the rage building in his chest, Garrison handed over the official documents, his expression troubled. "Daniel, I want you to know this isn't personal. These orders come from territorial headquarters, backed by witnesses and testimony from medical authorities." Daniel scanned the legal language, his heart sinking as he realized the thoroughness of Blackwood's preparation. The warrant cited specific cases where Evelyn had provided medical assistance, characterizing her interventions as fraudulent treatments that endangered public health. Dr. Porter was named as a co-conspirator who had provided false legitimacy to dangerous practices. "This is manufactured evidence," Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Every person Miss Clark has helped would testify to the legitimacy of her methods." "That may be, but the Territorial Medical Board has ruled that her practices constitute unauthorized medicine. The federal charges stem from complaints filed by families who claim they were deceived about the nature of her treatments." Evelyn stepped onto the porch, her posture straight and dignified despite the circumstances. She'd dressed carefully in her best dress, as if she'd been expecting this moment. "Marshal Garrison, I assume you're here for me." "Yes, ma'am. I'm afraid I need to place you under arrest pending trial on the charges I've outlined." "Before you do that," Evelyn said quietly, "would you allow me to demonstrate exactly what kind of fraud I've been practicing?" Garrison looked confused. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Clark. I mean that one of your deputies appears to be suffering from chronic pain in his left shoulder, an old injury that never healed properly. Another has a persistent cough that's been troubling him for weeks. If my abilities are fraudulent, surely a demonstration would be harmless." The marshal glanced at his men, noting the surprised expressions on their faces. Deputy Williams had, indeed, been favoring his left shoulder since an injury sustained during a pursuit 6 months earlier, and Deputy Carson's persistent cough had been a source of concern for weeks. "Miss Clark," Garrison said carefully, "I can't allow you to practice medicine on federal officers." "I'm not asking to practice medicine," Evelyn replied. "I'm simply offering to touch their hands. If nothing happens, you'll have evidence that the claims against me are justified. If something does happen—" She paused, meeting his gaze despite the cloth covering her eyes. "Then perhaps you'll understand why people like Mr. Blackwood are so eager to control what I can do." Daniel watched the exchange with growing admiration for Evelyn's courage and strategic thinking. She was turning her arrest into an opportunity to demonstrate the truth of her abilities, forcing the federal officers to confront the reality of what they were being asked to suppress. "Marshal," Deputy Williams spoke up, his voice tight with pain, "if the lady's offering to help with this shoulder, I wouldn't mind letting her try. Doc Sullivan says there's nothing more conventional medicine can do for it." Garrison hesitated, clearly torn between his duty to execute the warrant and his curiosity about the abilities that had generated such intense federal interest. "Miss Clark, if I allow this demonstration, you understand it won't change the legal proceedings. I still have to execute this warrant." "I understand completely." I'm simply asking for the chance to show you what you're really arresting me for." After a moment's deliberation, Garrison nodded. "Deputy Williams, if you're willing—" Williams stepped forward, extending his left hand toward Evelyn. The moment her fingers made contact with his palm, the familiar warm sensation began to flow between them. But this time it was different, stronger, more focused than Daniel had ever witnessed. It was as if the crisis had somehow amplified her abilities, allowing her to channel healing energy with unprecedented intensity. Williams gasped as the chronic pain that had plagued him for months simply vanished. He rotated his shoulder experimentally, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement to something approaching awe. "The pain is completely gone," he said wonderingly. "For the first time in 6 months, I can move my arm without that grinding ache." Deputy Carson, witnessing his colleague's transformation, stepped forward without being asked. "Miss, if you could do something about this cough." Evelyn placed her hands on Carson's chest, and within moments the persistent congestion that had troubled him for weeks began to clear. His breathing became deeper and easier, the chronic irritation in his lungs fading as if it had never existed. "Incredible," Carson murmured. "I can breathe clearly for the first time in weeks." Marshal Garrison stared at his deputies, then at Evelyn, clearly struggling to reconcile what he'd witnessed with the charges he was supposed to enforce. "Miss Clark, what you've just done, how is this possible?" "I don't know how it's possible, Marshal. I only know that when I touch someone who's suffering, sometimes I can help ease their pain. The families who filed complaints against me, I guarantee they never received my services. Mr. Blackwood has manufactured those testimonies to create legal justification for taking me into custody." "That's a serious accusation," Garrison said. "It's the truth, and I can prove it if you'll give me the chance." Daniel stepped forward, seeing an opportunity to turn the crisis to their advantage. "Marshal, what if we could demonstrate that the complaints against Miss Clark are fabricated? Would that change the validity of the warrant?" "If I could prove that the evidence supporting these charges was fraudulent, yes, it would invalidate the warrant, but that's a significant burden of proof." "Then let's meet it," Evelyn said with quiet determination. "I propose we visit every family supposedly making complaints against me. Let them tell you directly whether they've ever received my services." What followed was an extraordinary day-long investigation that took them to homesteads and settlements throughout the region. Marshal Garrison, clearly intrigued by the demonstration he'd witnessed, agreed to verify the testimonies that formed the basis of the charges against Evelyn. Their first stop was the Henderson farm, where the family was supposedly claiming that Evelyn had provided fraudulent treatment for their eldest daughter's leg injury. When they arrived, however, Mary Henderson greeted them with confusion and indignation. "Fraudulent treatment?" she repeated, staring at the federal marshal in bewilderment. "Marshal, we've never even met Miss Clark. Our daughter injured her leg in a fall 3 weeks ago, and it's healing just fine with conventional care. Who told you we'd made complaints?" The pattern repeated itself at every location listed in the warrant. Families who had supposedly filed complaints against Evelyn had never met her, never received her services, and had no idea why their names were attached to federal charges. More damning still, several families mentioned being visited by well-dressed strangers who had asked detailed questions about their medical needs and family circumstances. "Someone's been conducting a systematic investigation of frontier families with medical issues," Garrison concluded as they returned to Daniel's homestead that evening. "They've used real families' names and circumstances to create false testimonies." "Mr. Blackwood and his associates," Daniel said grimly. "They've manufactured an entire case to give legal cover to what amounts to kidnapping." Marshal Garrison was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what they'd discovered. "Miss Clark, the warrant I carry is based on fraudulent evidence That makes it invalid under federal law. What happens now? Evelyn asked. Now I file a report detailing this investigation and recommending that charges be brought against whoever manufactured this evidence. You're free, Miss Clark, but I suspect this isn't over. People with enough influence to manipulate federal law enforcement don't give up easily. As if summoned by Garrison's words, the sound of approaching horses filled the evening air. But this time, it wasn't law enforcement. It was Preston Blackwood himself, accompanied by a small army of private security guards and what appeared to be a federal bureaucrat in an expensive suit. "Marshal Garrison," Blackwood called out as he dismounted, his urbane confidence replaced by cold determination. "I trust you've completed the arrest of Miss Clark." "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, I've completed an investigation that revealed your warrant to be based on fraudulent evidence. Miss Clark is a free woman." Blackwood's expression darkened, but his voice remained controlled. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Marshal. Allow me to introduce Federal Administrator Jonathan Whitfield from the Department of Territorial Affairs." Whitfield stepped forward, a thin man with pale eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to wielding bureaucratic power. "Marshal Garrison, I'm here to inform you that Miss Clark's case has been elevated to federal jurisdiction under the Territorial Security Act. She's to be transferred to federal custody immediately for evaluation of potential threats to public safety." Daniel felt the blood drain from his face. The Territorial Security Act was a broad piece of legislation designed to address threats to federal authority in frontier regions. Under its provisions, individuals could be detained indefinitely, without formal charges, if they were deemed to pose risks to territorial stability. "On what grounds?" Garrison demanded. "On the grounds that Miss Clark possesses abilities that could be used to deceive or manipulate federal officials, as demonstrated by her influence over your deputies earlier today," Whitfield replied smoothly. "Such capabilities represent a clear security risk that requires immediate federal oversight." "You're twisting what happened," Daniel protested. "She healed their injuries, nothing more." "She demonstrated an ability to alter the physical and mental state of federal officers through unknown means," Whitfield corrected. "That constitutes a potential threat to national security." Evelyn stepped forward, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Administrator Whitfield, if my abilities represent such a threat, surely you'd want to understand them better before taking drastic action. Would you allow me to demonstrate that they're focused solely on healing, not manipulation or deception?" "I'm afraid that won't be possible, Miss Clark. Federal policy regarding individuals with anomalous capabilities is quite clear. Immediate isolation and evaluation under controlled conditions." "You mean imprisonment?" Daniel said bluntly. "I mean appropriate precautions for public safety." The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of yet another party. Dr. Porter, accompanied by James and Martha Whitmore and more than a dozen other families that Evelyn had helped over the past months. Word of her arrest had spread through the frontier communities, and people had come from across the territory to testify on her behalf. "Administrator Whitfield," Dr. Porter called out as he approached. "I'm Dr. William Porter, and I represent the Territorial Medical Association. We're here to formally protest the persecution of Miss Clark, whose medical contributions to frontier communities have been extraordinary and entirely beneficial." James Whitmore stepped forward, his weathered face set with determination. "Sir, I don't know who you are or what authority you think you have, but Miss Clark saved my daughter's life. If you think you're going to take her away to some federal prison, you'll have to go through every family she's helped." The crowd of supporters murmured agreement, their collective presence transforming the confrontation from a legal proceeding into a community uprising. These were hard-working frontier families who understood the value of what Evelyn provided and were willing to defend her against federal overreach. Administrator Whitfield looked nervous as he surveyed the growing crowd. His bureaucratic authority was impressive on paper, but it carried less weight when faced with determined citizens willing to protect someone they valued. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier confidence. "What's irregular," Dr. Porter replied, "is using federal security laws to kidnap a woman whose only crime is healing sick children." Evelyn moved to the center of the gathering, her voice carrying clearly to everyone present. "Friends, I appreciate your support more than I can express, but I don't want anyone to face legal consequences for defending me. Mr. Blackwood, Administrator Whitfield, I'll make you a proposition." "Miss Clark," Daniel started to object, but she raised her hand to stop him. "I'll submit to federal evaluation, but only under specific conditions. The evaluation must be conducted publicly, with representatives from the communities I've served present as witnesses. Any testing of my abilities must be focused on helping people, not studying me like a laboratory specimen, and the evaluation must have a time limit, 30 days, to determine whether I pose any genuine threat to public safety." Blackwood and Whitfield exchanged glances, clearly not expecting such a bold counteroffer. "And if you're found to be a security risk," Whitfield asked, "then I'll accept federal custody. But if I'm found to pose no threat, all federal interest in my case ends permanently. No more harassment, no more manufactured charges, no more attempts to control or exploit my abilities." The crowd fell silent, understanding that Evelyn was gambling everything on her ability to prove her worth under federal scrutiny. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was also the only way to end the cycle of threats and persecution that had been escalating around them. After a long moment, Administrator Whitfield nodded slowly. "Very well, Miss Clark. 30 days of evaluation under the conditions you've specified. But understand, if you're found to pose any threat to federal authority or public safety, the consequences will be severe." "I understand completely," Evelyn replied, "and I'm confident that 30 days will be more than enough time to prove that healing is never a threat to anyone." As the various parties dispersed to prepare for the evaluation that would determine Evelyn's fate, Daniel found himself both proud of her courage and terrified of what they were about to face. The next 30 days would test not only Evelyn's abilities, but the strength of the community they'd built together and the bonds of trust that had sustained them through every challenge. The transformation was complete. They were no longer simply a sheriff and a healer trying to help their neighbors. They had become symbols in a larger struggle between those who sought to control extraordinary abilities for personal gain and those who believed such gifts should serve the common good. The battle ahead would determine not just their future, but the future of everyone who believed that healing should belong to those who needed it most. The 30-day federal evaluation began with the construction of a temporary medical facility in the center of Millfield Creek, erected specifically to accommodate the unprecedented nature of Evelyn's assessment. What emerged was part courthouse, part hospital, and part public forum, a space where the extraordinary would be subjected to scientific scrutiny under the watchful eyes of an entire community. Dr. Marcus Rothschild, the federal medical examiner, brought in from Washington to conduct the evaluation, was a man of impressive credentials but limited frontier experience. He arrived expecting to debunk what he assumed would be elaborate parlor tricks performed by a clever charlatan. Instead, he found himself confronting phenomena that challenged every assumption he held about the nature of healing itself. "Miss Clark," Dr. Rothschild said on the first morning of the evaluation, his tone professional but skeptical, "I've reviewed the claims made about your abilities, and I must say they strain credibility. However, I'm committed to conducting a thorough and fair assessment. The temporary facility was packed with observers, federal officials, territorial representatives, medical professionals, and dozens of frontier families who had traveled great distances to witness the proceedings. Daniel sat in the front row, his expression tense but supportive, while Dr. Porter served as Evelyn's medical advocate throughout the process. "Doctor," Evelyn replied with quiet dignity, "I appreciate your skepticism. It's important that any evaluation be conducted with scientific rigor. I only ask that you approach this with an open mind." The first week consisted of controlled experiments designed to test the limits and mechanisms of Evelyn's abilities. Dr. Rothschild brought in patients with documented medical conditions, people suffering from chronic pain, degenerative diseases, and injuries that conventional medicine had declared untreatable. The results were nothing short of extraordinary. Under carefully monitored conditions, with multiple witnesses and detailed medical documentation, Evelyn successfully treated condition after condition that had been deemed hopeless. Arthritis that had crippled a veteran for years disappeared. Under her touch, a child's withered arm, damaged by polio, regained strength and function. An elderly woman's failing eyesight was restored to near-perfect clarity. The cellular regeneration we're observing, Dr. Rothschild confided to his fellow examiners after the first week, defies every principle of medical science, I understand. Yet the results are undeniable and thoroughly documented. But it was during the second week that the true test came, a crisis that would determine not just Evelyn's fate, but the integrity of the entire evaluation process. A mining accident at the Silver Creek operation, 20 miles from town, resulted in a catastrophic collapse that trapped 6 men underground. When word reached the evaluation facility, the rescue operation had been underway for 18 hours, with little hope of reaching the trapped miners in time. "Miss Clark," Dr. Rothschild said as reports of the disaster reached them, "this presents an opportunity to test your abilities under genuine emergency conditions. Are you willing to assist in the rescue effort?" "Of course," Evelyn replied without hesitation, "but I should warn you, I've never attempted anything on this scale before. Multiple victims, severe injuries, extreme circumstances. I don't know if my abilities will be sufficient." The journey to Silver Creek became a procession of hope and determination. The evaluation team, community supporters, and federal observers traveled together to witness what many believed would be the definitive test of Evelyn's gift. Daniel rode beside the wagon carrying Evelyn and Dr. Rothschild, his heart heavy with worry about what they would find at the mine site. The scene at Silver Creek was one of controlled desperation. Mine foreman Patrick O'Sullivan had been coordinating rescue efforts around the clock, but the unstable conditions underground made traditional rescue attempts extremely dangerous. The trapped men were running out of air, and conventional approaches would take days they didn't have. "Dr. Rothschild," O'Sullivan said as the evaluation team arrived, "I appreciate any help you can provide, but I have to be honest. We're looking at a recovery operation at this point, not a rescue." "Not necessarily," Dr. Rothschild replied, his scientific skepticism having evolved into cautious optimism after witnessing Evelyn's documented successes. "Miss Clark may be able to provide assistance that goes beyond conventional medical intervention." When they finally reached the trapped miners, lowered into the mine shaft through a hastily constructed pulley system, the situation was even more dire than reports had suggested. 3 of the men were unconscious from oxygen deprivation, 2 had severe crushing injuries from falling debris, and 1 appeared to be in the final stages of carbon monoxide poisoning. "Can you help them?" Dr. Rothschild asked as they surveyed the scene by lamplight. Evelyn knelt beside the first unconscious miner, placing her hands on his chest. "I can try, but this is beyond anything I've attempted before. The injuries are so severe, and there are so many of them." What followed was the most extraordinary demonstration of healing that any of the witnesses had ever imagined. Working methodically from miner to miner, Evelyn channeled her abilities with an intensity that seemed to draw on reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. The warm, healing energy that flowed from her hands was visible to everyone present, a soft golden light that pulsed with the rhythm of life itself. The first miner's breathing strengthened and deepened as oxygen levels in his blood were somehow restored without additional air supply. The second man's crushed ribs realigned and healed before their eyes, internal bleeding stopping as damaged organs repaired themselves. Most remarkably, the miner suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning, who should have died from the levels of toxic gas in his system, began to recover as his blood chemistry somehow returned to normal. "This is impossible," Dr. Rothschild whispered, monitoring vital signs that defied medical explanation. "She's not just treating symptoms, she's reversing damage that should be irreversible." But the effort was taking a tremendous toll on Evelyn. With each healing, she grew paler and more exhausted, as if she were transferring her own life force to restore the dying men. By the time she reached the sixth and final miner, she was barely conscious herself. "Miss Clark, you need to stop," Daniel said urgently, kneeling beside her as she swayed with exhaustion. "You're going to kill yourself. Just one more," she whispered, placing trembling hands on the final victim. "He has children. I can sense them in his thoughts. They need their father." The final healing was the most dramatic of all. The miner had suffered catastrophic internal injuries that should have been fatal, but under Evelyn's touch, his body began to repair itself with visible speed. Broken bones knitted together, torn organs regenerated, and lost blood was somehow replenished from unknown sources. When it was over, all 6 miners were not only alive, but completely healthy, better than they had been before the accident. And Evelyn had collapsed into Daniel's arms, unconscious from the enormous expenditure of energy the mass healing had required. The rescue at Silver Creek changed everything. Word of the miraculous healing spread across the territory and beyond, carried by telegraph to newspapers in major cities. What had begun as a federal evaluation of a potentially dangerous individual had become a demonstration of extraordinary benevolence that captured the imagination of the entire nation. Dr. Rothschild's final report to the federal authorities was unequivocal. Miss Evelyn Clark possesses healing abilities that represent a tremendous asset to human welfare, not a threat to public safety. Her demonstrated commitment to using these gifts in service of others, particularly those most in need, makes her a person of exceptional moral character who deserves protection and support, not persecution. But the most significant transformation occurred in the relationship between Daniel and Evelyn themselves. During her recovery from the mine rescue, as she spent weeks regaining her strength, Daniel finally voiced what both of them had been feeling, but neither had been willing to acknowledge. "Evelyn," he said one evening as they sat by the fire in their newly peaceful home, "I need to tell you something that I should have said long ago." She turned toward him with that familiar gesture of complete attention. "What is it, Daniel?" "When I bought you at that auction, I thought I was rescuing someone who needed help. But the truth is, you rescued me. You brought me back to life, gave me purpose, helped me remember what it meant to truly live rather than just exist. Daniel, I love you," he said simply. "Not as a caretaker or a protector, but as a man loves a woman he wants to spend his life with. I know the circumstances of how we met were complicated, and I know you deserve better than—" "Stop," she interrupted, reaching for his hand. "Don't you dare suggest I deserve better than you. Daniel Hayes, you're the finest man I've ever known. You saw worth in me when my own family cast me aside. You believed in my abilities when others called them witchcraft. You stood by me when powerful people tried to destroy us both." She paused, her voice growing softer. "I love you too. I have for months, but I was afraid that saying so would complicate everything we'd built together. And now I think we've proven that we can handle just about any complication the world throws at us." Their wedding took place 6 months later in the same church where Lucy Whitmore had recovered from her near drowning. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people from across the territory, frontier families they'd helped, medical professionals who'd witnessed Evelyn's work, and federal officials who had come to see her as a national treasure rather than a security threat. Preston Blackwood and his associates had disappeared from the scene, their influence neutralized by the public attention that Evelyn's case had attracted. Federal policy regarding individuals with extraordinary abilities had been revised to emphasize protection and support rather than control and exploitation. Dr. Porter officially joined their partnership, and together they established the Frontier Medical Circuit, a traveling practice that brought advanced medical care to remote communities throughout the Western Territories. Evelyn's healing abilities, combined with Daniel's knowledge of the region and Dr. Porter's conventional medical expertise, created something unprecedented in American healthcare. Their first permanent facility was built in Millfield Creek, serving as a base of operations for their circuit work, but also as a training center where other healers could learn to develop and use their own gifts responsibly. Word spread that people with unusual abilities would find acceptance and purpose there, not persecution or exploitation. "Do you ever think about that day at the auction?" Daniel asked one afternoon, as they worked together in the expanded medical garden behind their home. Evelyn smiled, her hands deep in soil that seemed to respond to her touch with unusual vitality. "Sometimes, but that woman feels like someone I used to know, not who I am now." "She was brave," Daniel observed, "standing there with such dignity despite everything." "She was surviving," Evelyn corrected. "This is living." Around them, the sounds of their growing community carried on the autumn air, patients recovering in the adjoining facility, students learning to channel their own healing gifts, families sharing meals and stories in the common areas they'd established. It was more than either of them had ever dreamed of creating. As the sun set over Millfield Creek, casting golden light across the valley where natural healing springs bubbled with their ancient promise of renewal, Daniel and Evelyn Hayes understood that they had found something extraordinary. It wasn't just love or partnership or even the fulfillment of their individual gifts. It was the knowledge that they had created something larger than themselves, something that would continue to heal and help long after they were gone. The blind woman who had once been sold at auction had become a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that extraordinary gifts should serve the common good. The grieving sheriff, who had lost his way after his wife's death, had rediscovered his purpose in protecting and serving those who needed it most. Together, they had built a legacy of healing that would endure for generations. Proof that sometimes the most broken people, when they find each other, can create something beautiful, enough to change the world. 5 years after their wedding, the Frontier Medical Circuit had expanded beyond anything they had originally envisioned. What began as a traveling practice serving remote homesteads had evolved into a network of healing centers stretching across 3 territories, each one staffed by individuals who possessed various forms of extraordinary abilities. There was Sarah Chen, a Chinese immigrant whose touch could accelerate bone healing with remarkable precision. Miguel Santos, a former vaquero who could sense internal injuries through proximity alone. Rebecca Thompson, a young widow who discovered she could ease the emotional trauma that often accompanied physical wounds. Each of them had found their way to Millfield Creek, after word spread that people with unusual gifts would find acceptance and training rather than fear and persecution. "The network is growing faster than we can properly support," Dr. Porter observed during one of their monthly planning meetings. He was now in his 70s, but remained as dedicated as ever to their mission. We have requests for new centers from as far away as California and the Dakota Territory. Daniel, now wearing the badge of Territorial Marshal, a promotion that had come with federal recognition of his exceptional service, spread out a map of their current operations. The challenge isn't just geographic expansion, it's maintaining the quality and integrity of what we do while scaling up to meet demand. Evelyn, her hair now streaked with silver, but her abilities stronger than ever, traced patterns on the map. With her finger, "What concerns me most is ensuring that every new healer understands the responsibility that comes with these gifts. Power without wisdom can be dangerous, even when it's the power to heal." Their concerns proved prophetic when reports reached them of a rogue healer operating in the Colorado mining camps. Thomas Brennan, no relation to the auctioneer from years past, had begun charging exorbitant fees for his services and making grandiose claims about his abilities that went far beyond what was medically possible. Worse, he was leaving behind patients who were temporarily improved but eventually suffered relapses that were worse than their original conditions. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Daniel said, as they read the latest report from a concerned doctor in Denver. "Someone using healing abilities for personal gain without proper understanding or ethical foundation. We need to intervene." Evelyn decided not just to stop him, but to help him if possible. No one is born understanding how to use these gifts responsibly. The journey to Colorado took them through familiar territory, but also into new regions where their reputation had preceded them. In small towns and mining camps, they found that word of the frontier medical circuit had created hope where none had existed before. Families who had resigned themselves to living with chronic conditions now believed that help might be possible. But they also encountered resistance from established medical practitioners who viewed their methods with suspicion, and from certain religious groups who continued to denounce supernatural healing as contrary to divine will. The polarization of opinion reminded them that their work existed at the intersection of science, faith, and human need, a complex space that not everyone was prepared to navigate. When they finally confronted Thomas Brennan in the mining town of Silver Ridge, they found a man whose gifts were genuine, but whose understanding of them was dangerously incomplete. He was young, perhaps 25, with the desperate hunger of someone who had grown up poor and saw his abilities as a path to wealth and security. "You think you can just waltz in here and tell me how to use my own gifts?" Brennan challenged. When they met him at the crude medical tent he had erected on the outskirts of town, "I've helped more people in 6 months than most doctors help in years." "And how many have you hurt?" Evelyn asked quietly, her enhanced perception immediately picking up the emotional turmoil surrounding him. "I can sense the guilt you're carrying. Thomas, you know that some of your treatments haven't lasted." Brennan's defiance cracked slightly. "Sometimes things don't work perfectly. That's true of regular medicine too, but regular medicine doesn't claim to be miraculous," Daniel pointed out. "When you charge desperate families their life savings for treatments that might not last, you're not just taking their money, you're stealing their hope." Dr. Porter, who had accompanied them on this intervention, stepped forward with the medical bag that had become his constant companion. "Son, would you allow me to examine some of your recent patients? Not to challenge you, but to understand. What's happening with these relapses?" What they discovered was troubling but not unexpected. Brennan's healing abilities were powerful but unfocused. He could indeed repair damaged tissue and restore function, but he lacked the deeper understanding necessary to address root causes. His healings were temporary patches rather than genuine cures, and in some cases the energy required to maintain them was actually drawing strength from the patients themselves. "You're healing the symptoms, but not the underlying conditions," Evelyn explained as they reviewed Dr. Porter's findings. It's like building a house on an unstable foundation. It might look perfect initially, but it won't last. So what am I supposed to do? Brennan asked, his earlier hostility replaced by genuine distress. Stop helping people altogether? Come with us, Evelyn offered. Learn to use your abilities properly. Understand the responsibility that comes with them. The people you've been trying to help deserve healers who know what they're doing. The process of retraining Brennan took months, but it provided valuable insights that improved their entire program. They developed more rigorous screening processes for potential healers, more comprehensive training programs, and better ongoing support systems to prevent similar situations from arising. More importantly, the Colorado incident led to the establishment of the Healing Ethics Council, a governing body that included medical professionals, community representatives, and experienced healers who could provide oversight and guidance for the growing network of supernatural medical practitioners. We're not just teaching people to heal, Evelyn reflected during one of the council's first meetings. We're creating an entirely new profession with all the responsibilities and standards that entails. The council's first major policy decision was to establish strict guidelines about charging for healing services. While healers needed to support themselves financially, the council mandated that ability to pay could never be a factor in determining who received treatment. A sliding scale fee system was implemented, with wealthy patients subsidizing care for those who couldn't afford it. As their 8th anniversary approached, Daniel and Evelyn found themselves reflecting on how far they'd traveled, not just geographically, but in terms of their personal growth and the impact they'd been able to achieve. The Frontier Medical Circuit now operated 23 healing centers across the Western Territories, had trained over 100 healers, and had treated thousands of patients who otherwise would have had no access to the care they needed. But perhaps more significantly, they had begun to change societal attitudes toward people with extraordinary abilities. What had once been viewed with suspicion or fear was increasingly recognized as a valuable contribution to human welfare. Federal legislation had been passed protecting individuals with healing gifts from discrimination, and several universities had established research programs dedicated to understanding supernatural medical phenomena. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Evelyn asked as they sat on the porch of their Millfield Creek home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "About figuring out the rest as we went along?" Daniel smiled, taking her hand in his. "I had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. Neither did I. But I think that was part of what made it work. We didn't have preconceived notions about what was possible or impossible. We just responded to what was needed." "And what's needed now?" Evelyn was quiet for a moment, her head tilted in that familiar listening pose. But now she wasn't just listening to immediate surroundings. She was attuning herself to something larger, the collective needs and hopes of all the communities they served. "Sustainability," she said finally. "We've proven that this works, but we need to ensure it continues to work long after we're gone. We need to train the next generation of leaders, establish permanent funding sources, and create institutional structures that can survive beyond any individual personalities." "That sounds like you're thinking about retirement." "Not retirement," she clarified with a laugh. "Evolution. We've been pioneers, but now we need to become architects, building something that will last." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman on horseback, riding with the urgent pace that both of them had learned to recognize as a medical emergency. But as she dismounted and approached the porch, they realized she wasn't seeking immediate treatment. Marshall Hayes," the woman said, slightly out of breath. "My name is Elena Rodriguez. I've ridden 3 days from Santa Fe to find you." "What can we do for you, Miss Rodriguez?" Daniel asked, rising to greet her properly. "It's About my brother. He's like Miss Clark. He can heal people, but he's young and scared and hiding what he can do. Our family doesn't understand, and the local priest says it's the devil's work." She turned to Evelyn with desperate hope. "I heard you might be able to help him." Evelyn stood as well, extending her hand toward the young woman. The moment their skin made contact, she could sense the truth of the story. A frightened teenage boy with powerful healing abilities, hiding in fear while his family struggled to understand what was happening to him. "Of course we'll help," Evelyn said without hesitation. "That's exactly why we're here." As they began making plans for the journey to Santa Fe, Daniel reflected on how their mission continued to evolve and expand. Every person they trained, every family they helped, every community they served, created ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate intervention. "You know what I think the real miracle is," he said to Evelyn as they prepared for yet another journey into unknown territory. "What's that?" "Not the healing abilities themselves, but the fact that we've created something that helps people discover the best versions of themselves. You didn't just heal Lucy Whitmore's hypothermia or those miners' injuries. You showed all of us what was possible when we choose compassion over fear, service over self-interest." "We showed them," Evelyn corrected gently. "This was never about one person's abilities. It was always about what we could accomplish together." As they set out for Santa Fe the next morning, leading a small caravan that included Dr. Porter, several trainee healers, and enough supplies to establish a temporary clinic, Daniel and Evelyn Hayes understood that their story was far from over. Each new challenge, each frightened young healer, each family in need, represented not just another case to handle, but another opportunity to expand the circle of hope and healing they had been building for nearly a decade. The woman who had once stood on an auction block, defined by her limitations and sold like property, had become a leader whose influence extended across territories and whose vision of compassionate healing was transforming frontier medicine. The man who had bought her in a moment of instinctive kindness had discovered that true healing worked both ways. In saving others, they had saved themselves. Their legacy would not be measured in the number of people they had directly healed, but in the number of healers they had trained, the institutions they had built, and the fundamental change in how society viewed and supported people with extraordinary gifts. They had proven that miracles were not rare supernatural events, but the natural result of ordinary people choosing to use whatever abilities they possessed in service of others. In the end, it hadn't been about sight or blindness, wealth or poverty, conventional medicine or supernatural gifts. It was about two people choosing to see the best in each other and dedicating their lives to bringing out the best in everyone they encountered. And in a world that often seemed intent on dividing people by their differences, that choice made all the difference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.